Okay, we're here at Embry-Riddle, and I'm Joey Bobinsky. This is Gaye Lyn.
Gaye Lyn.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
No.
Oh, okay. So
did you want to give more of an intro than that?
So we're here talking about Veterans Air Express, which is your father's company.
Yes.
We just want to see what stories you can share with us. We just want to find out about your company,
Okay.
Your father's company.
My name is Gaye Lyn, and Veterans Air Express and Veterans Airline were the same company affiliates that my dad founded in 1945. He was 22 years old and just out of service, and had this idea, which we can go into detail later. And it was a childhood story to me. It was something that he talked about that my mom was not particularly happy about, in part because he missed my birth as a result of it. I was 3 days old before my father ever saw me. And years and years went by. He had given me some press clippings, but I had no sense of the size of it, anything like that. And in April of 2015, my life was such that I had the time, and I decided to look into it. And it basically changed my life. I mean, my findings were totally unexpected, and just a wealth of information. My dad probably had graduated from high school, certainly no further education than that, other than life. And he was from West Virginia. He was a West Virginia native, loved the out of doors, was fantastic with animals, learned to shoot with a single bolt action .22 rifle that he many years later taught me to shoot with. And the idea that he would have established an organization like this is pretty far-fetched.
Mm-hmm. Really?
And that's the beginning of the story.
Yeah. Okay, so what gave him the idea to start the airline?
He was meeting a lot of unemployed vets like himself, who had learned about aviation in the service. They'd learned to fly, they'd learned to navigate, be flight engineers, turn wrenches, and they had found something that they loved, and they wanted to make their living at it in peacetime. So that was the first part. Second part was he knew that there were a lot of war surplus aircraft that the government was looking to dispose of. The third part is a little bit more mysterious to me, in that his idea was not only to fly cargo, but to fly fresh produce. And I'm not sure where that came from, but he took himself to Newark, New Jersey. He and my mom were already married, and they were living in New Jersey. He took himself to the wholesale produce section of Newark and was walking up and down the streets and kind of absorbing the activity, and then walked into Brenner Produce Company and said he wanted to speak with the owner, and he wanted to speak to him about a business idea. And a couple of hours later, my dad walked out with a big grin on his face, because he had met the owner, Arthur Brenner, and my father could be very persuasive, but I don't think he would have persuaded this man to this idea if there really wasn't something solid in it. To the point that during the time my dad was there, Brenner picked up the phone and called his company's attorney, Harvey Stevenson, and said, "Harvey, I need you to come meet this young man." And they talked about the idea, and within less than a week, they were producing, Harvey was pulling together articles of incorporation to establish a company. They printed, I brought this with me because it's fun. they printed stock certificates before they had finished naming the company. Originally, they were going to call it Air Express, and then it dawned on them Veterans Air Express would be more powerful, and besides which it would really incorporate what my dad's original idea was, and that would be a company owned by the vets that were running it. Even if there were other investors, they would still have control over the company. So that was the genesis.
How neat. Did he have a mentor or advisor that helped him along?
I would say that Arthur Brenner was probably the closest. Arthur contacted produce companies up and down the East Coast to sort of get their pulse and see if they thought that there was if the idea was valid.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that Arthur helped initiate some of the first business as well as for his own company. On the other hand, my dad was in Louisville, Kentucky, and this is how he missed my birth. And my father was not a pilot at this point. He didn't learn to fly until after the airline. He had been a gunnery instructor at Tyndall Air Force Base, as I understand. Funny, I've researched a lot of the men that worked for the airline. I still haven't finished researching my dad's military records. But Dad was in Lexington arranging the first payload of cargo for the company. And before he left, my mom said, "Saunie, don't go. The baby's going to be born. There's nothing that could prevent me from being here when our baby is born." 3 days later, he was socked in. The weather was bad. There was evidently some sort of telecommunications strike going on. Anyway, so that was the beginning of the business. I don't think that they had much management background within the crews that had joined. There was a board of directors, and one of the board of directors owned an insurance company, so he had management capability. He may have been a bit of an advisor, but he didn't have aviation experience. So,
it's incredible. What were the men and women like who joined Veterans Air?
I can speak from personal experience on some of this. And if I may, just an aside, I eventually, through my research, found 11 or 12 families. I found among them 4 of my dad's men that I met face to face, which would never have expected that. Another man I communicated with through email, and one of the men lives in northern New Jersey, and we talk on the phone from time to time. It just, they were, I think, pretty exceptional people. I've got a graphic that lists the number of Distinguished Crosses that they had earned and Purple Hearts, and among them, they had 60,000 hours of flying time. So I'm fond of saying this was no ragtag team. There's another picture where they look like they've just stepped off the cover of Esquire magazine, and they all went to the same haberdasher. And I've only been able to identify not quite half of the men in the photograph, but this is a very early photo, and they're standing by a DC-3. I don't know whether it was the Gaye. Did I tell you that one of the DC-3s was named after me? I missed that. That's a pretty important,
Oh, yeah.
For me it's important. One of the first 2 DC-3s was actually named after me like 3 days after I was born. So maybe that was Dad's mea culpa to Mom that he wasn't there when I was born. they were as enthused with my father's idea and the dream as he was. When I started, I thought this was my dad's story. It's not. It's the story of every one of the people that got involved, some of whom I've been blessed to meet, families whom I've met, and I'm sure by the end of our conversation, I won't have mentioned half of them, but that doesn't mean that I don't understand the importance of them.
Mm-hmm. Do you know what training they had received, the employees?
Yeah, World War II, Uncle Sam. I mean, they were as fresh out of service as my dad was, and some of them had flown military air transport, but they were all doing duck and cover. They are one of the men who was a navigator, and his name is Robert Grease. He navigated the first U.S. bombers to fly into Germany. So that's the caliber of skill and bravado that we're talking about here. While he navigated for us, also had a business sense or was very good with numbers. So he spent quite a bit of time in the office, and I've met his widow. As a matter of fact, I just saw her most recently this week. She lives in southern Florida. And she had told me a number of times that Bob was concerned about the lack of depth in the management group, that, quote unquote, they don't know what they're doing. She used that expression more than once, so I have great faith that that's exactly what Bob said to her.
Mm-hmm.
And therein lies part of the end of the story, but we're not going there yet.
Mm-hmm. We're not quite there. Do you know how they staff flights?
We got a contract with the United Nations, and we were flying war surplus, fertilized hatching eggs, unhatched. We went 3 flights to Prague and 2 flights to Warsaw with the hatching eggs. For those flights, and these were our DC-4, this was a DC-4 we were using, we had full crews. We had a captain, initially 2 first officers, sometimes 2 radio operators, one time 3 flight engineers. So we had all the positions covered and sometimes backup, because failure was not an option. And especially with the flight engineers and the DC-3s, or the DC-4s, sorry, we needed to have our immediate backup. We couldn't wait for somebody to come to our aid. One of my favorite stories, Thomas Cowart from South Carolina was one of our men, and Thomas was a flight engineer. But before he became a flight engineer, he was a Georgia farmer boy who took care of tractors and made them run. And when he enlisted in the Army Air Corps, they had sense enough to think, if he can make tractors run, he could probably make airplanes do a pretty good job. And he became an aircraft mechanic, and then he eventually got flying status. So when he came to us, and I met him, and he told me the story that on one of the UN flights, they were coming back, one of the number 4 engine, he didn't like the way it sounded, and while they were on an overnight stop, he took a tall ladder, went out to the airplane by himself, climbed up on the wing, took the cowling off, and changed the spark plugs.
Oh, wow.
By himself. So it's a favorite story for me because it's very indicative of the kind of people that were in the organization. And now I've forgotten the question. What was the question? How did we staff?
Yeah.
Yes. The DC-3s flew domestically, and that's kind of a big hole in my research. I know that they did fly produce and flowers, gladiolas seemed to be part of the cargo, and they flew live lobsters from Maine to Florida. Usually, there were 2 flights that I've been told about that got as far as Teterboro in New Jersey, and the weather was so bad they landed, and they never made it to Florida. And my dad brought the lobsters home. Now, they're ocean creatures, so you can't put them in fresh water, but he put them in the dry bathtub. And my mom came home on one of these occasions to a huge party on our front lawn. Now, we lived in a very small apartment in Rahway, New Jersey. And at this point, have I been born? Yeah, of course I've been born. He invited everybody in the neighborhood, most of whom we didn't know, and he was cooking up a storm in the kitchen because he didn't want the lobsters to go to waste. Yeah. And he knew that the weather wasn't going to clear and they weren't going to get the lobsters down to Florida. So these little sidebar stories. But as far as the passenger service on the DC-3s, other than the Miami and Newark route that they did on the Snowbirds, I know that they flew in the Cape Cod area from Boston to, what would that have been? Out on the island. Can't think of it right now. But I don't know about any of their other passenger activity. In a newspaper, a magazine story, they talked about the plan was that we would fly down the eastern seaboard, across the southern states, and up the west coast. And there's a map like that among the graphics. And the purpose was not to go straight across the country where the majors were flying. We were trying to stay out of the way, pick up passengers where the majors weren't servicing so much. Mm-hmm. But I don't have specifics on how that was staffed. Obviously, a pilot and a co-pilot. I don't know that they had flight attendants.
Mm-hmm. Could you just give us a size of how many employees might have been in the company?
One of my basic research stories at the beginning was a June 1946 Air Transport magazine, three-page feature article. And they mentioned that we had 104 employees at that point. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean this with all due respect, but I hear my father's voice giving out that number, which means that it probably wasn't quite 104. However, during my research, I have come up with 62 names. So it was not, it was somewhere between 62 and 104.
Wow. What was your dad's favorite aircraft? We read that the DC-3 is named after Gaye Lyn. Yeah.
I would hope.
Can you tell us a little more about that particular aircraft?
I know that when it arrived to us as the other DC-3, it was in Army drab green. It had come from the Army. And our people did the exterior of the airplane. They painted it and put the striping on it and put my name on it. I know that he used it when he was looking into setting up a maintenance base down in Florida, in Sebring. It had been Hendricks Field, and they were converting it to a civilian airfield. So he was using it, I guess, to go out and drum up new business. I'm not quite sure what happened to it in the end. I've been tracing our airplanes, their genealogy, if you will. Mm-hmm. And one of the DC-3s ended up in shallow waters in the Bahamas. The pilot did an incredible job of landing. It wasn't ours. This was after we owned it. All right, I'm tracing it to find out what eventually happened to it. And the airplane had 27 passengers. Everybody survived. The passengers got out of the airplane because it had begun to slip into the water. They got out and actually pushed the airplane, with the help of the waves, back up on the shore.
Wow.
But it became basically a scuba dive. It was out there for a long time, and more recently, I understand that there's almost nothing left of it. I have not yet proven or disproven that was the Gaye Lyn, but it was one of our DC-3s for sure.
Okay.